Its author, Kevin Boyle, is born in Detroit. He attended University of Detroit, now University of Detroit Mercy. He received his doctorate from the University of Michigan, and I don't know why this is so important to me, other than it binds the two of us, but we both studied under Professor Sidney Fine, the eminent historian there. He is now gone over to the dark side and is a professor of history at Ohio State. But you have to look at it from the other side of the coin. Isn't it fascinating that Ohio has to import people from Michigan in order to teach the humanities? The Arc of Justice won the National Book Award in 2004, and it was the Michigan Notable Book in 2005, a finalist from the Pulitzer Prize. It was supported by grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Fulbright Commission, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Its author is witty and wise and insightful, and we're so lucky to have him here. He will be drawn out in discussion by the Honorable Judge William C. Whitbeck of the Michigan Court of Appeals, who I understand has several softballs and hardballs for Kevin Boyle. Please welcome our speaker, Dr. Boyle. I'm going to begin the presentation with a short film that the staff of the Humanities Council has created. I realize not all of you have completely read the book, so the film is not a spoiler. It'll just help set the tone for tonight's conversation.
Detroit, early 1900s. The city was growing rapidly. Immigrants flocked there to fill new jobs. They came from Europe and from across the United States. Thousands came from the South, white and black. Resentment grew against the large influx of migrants, with the white population changing its previous attitude toward black housing options.
Suddenly, what whites started to do was insist on a level of residential segregation they'd never insisted on before. They began to say African Americans can live in Black Bottom, that can be their neighborhood. They can't live anywhere else.
Indicative of the changing mood, the membership of the Ku Klux Klan surged across the United States, including Michigan and Detroit. With a successful practice serving the black community, Dr. Ocean Sweet and his wife Gladys decided to move out of Black Bottom and purchase a decent home for their growing family, choosing a house in an all-white neighborhood. Being aware of the volatile atmosphere, Dr. Sweet asked his brother and several friends to help him protect his property, with guns if necessary. On the second night after moving in, a large crowd numbering in the hundreds formed on the street just outside the house. A dozen police were in place for protection, but did little.
It was terrifying because they knew how dangerous the situation was. It was terrifying because they knew what happened to black people in a situation like this. They knew where this could end up.
Suddenly, rocks started raining down on the house. Windows shattered. Then, shots from the house. Across the street, neighborhood resident Leon Briner lay dead. Police rushed in and arrested everyone in the house. The prosecutor charged all of them with first-degree murder.
Now this is a hopeless case. And the chances that they are going to have any chance in this courtroom are infinitesimal.
The NAACP quickly became involved in the case, hiring the nation's foremost defense lawyer, Clarence Darrow. Darrow very carefully selected a jury of white men and remarkably achieved first a hung jury, then acquittal. A victory in the case momentarily provided comfort to the Sweets, but Detroit's difficulties with housing segregation would only become more problematic in the decades ahead.
To find out more about the Great Michigan Read and Kevin Boyle's Arc of Justice, please visit MichiganHumanities.org. Produced by Michigan Productions with support from the Michigan Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Before we get started, if I could just really quickly say thank you to the Michigan Humanities Council for both choosing the book, which is a tremendous honor, and for planning this tour. It's just been a great, great experience. You have no idea how much work has gone into this that they've done. So I just want to thank the council, and I want to thank Cooley Law School for hosting this, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. I just have one really, really quick thing I want to say. There was a little reception over the state capitol before tonight's event, and I got a chance to meet a woman by the name of Catherine Dove Noren, and I don't think she's here, but the reason that I bring it up is that Catherine Dove then was 1 year old when the Sweet case happened, and her parents lived directly across the street from the Sweet's house. And they'll get mentioned probably tonight, I suspect. So there's nothing more exciting as an historian than to have that kind of personal connection to something that you've spent a long time with. I do kind of wish I had met her a few years ago.
Also, my thanks to the Michigan Humanities Council, the Capital Area District Libraries, and to Cooley Law School. It's really a good thing that the law school engages in these kind of events, these kind of community activities. When I was in law school, the division between the University of Michigan and everybody else in the town of Ann Arbor was rather severe. I don't think I ever saw real citizens of Ann Arbor when I was in law school. Let me start, Kevin, by asking kind of a softball question, frankly, one that authors often receive, but I'll narrow it down a little. How did you choose to write this book? And let me narrow it down by asking,
Sure.
How did you choose to write this book, Arc of Justice, as compared to something else that you might have written? What brought you to this particular book?
That's a great question. Really, this book started for me, the foundation of this book for me was a question. A really very straightforward question that came out of my teaching. I teach, and by the way, you are a very polite crowd. Usually the Ohio State thing was way worse. I teach history at Ohio State, teach American history, and I have on and off taught a course on the civil rights movement. And one of the things that I did in that course, the first time I taught it, was I followed what I think is the story of civil rights that most of us know. If you ask most people, when did the civil rights movement start in America? What they're going to tell you, if they say anything at all, is they're going to say it started on a Thursday night. December 1st, 1955, when Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And then what they're going to tell you is they're going to tell you that that single act of defiance. You know what Mrs. Parks said on the bus that night?
I'm tired.
She said no. That's what she said. That single act of defiance then sparked a social movement that swept across the South in the 50s and 60s. And you could tell the steps it took. It went into the hallway of Little Rock Central High School in 1957. Sat down at the lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. Rode the bus into Anniston, Alabama in 1961. It enrolled at the University of Mississippi in 1962. Filled the streets of Birmingham, Alabama with children. In the spring of '63, it marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside of Selma, Alabama in 1965, and it died in an afternoon in April of 1968 on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. And that's the story of civil rights, as most Americans know it. And that's the story when I taught this class for the very first time I taught. And then afterwards, I started to think to myself, so what is that story anyways? What's the essence of that story that most of us think of as civil rights? This is what it is. White Americans, and particularly white Southerners, embraced the sin of racism. African Americans walked into the face of that sin. They took that sin on their shoulders. They suffered for that sin. They died for that sin. And by that blood sacrifice, they redeemed the soul of America. That the standard story of civil rights in America is, in other words, the Christian story of redemption. Here's the question. What I ask myself is, what happens if you look at a civil rights moment that isn't in the South, that isn't in the 1950s and 60s, that doesn't fit the standard story? What happens to that story of civil rights then? Does it become less redemptive? That's the question that underlay this book.
In writing the book, Kevin, and I'm going to open a phrase and read a little, which was in the movie clip. But what struck me about it in reading it was A, how good the history was, but B, how good the writing was.
Oh, thank you.
And I'll give you just an example. This is in the opening chapter. More than a decade had passed since Henry Ford, desperate to keep his workers on the line, doubled their wages in an unprecedented $5 a day. Word of Detroit's high-paying jobs had shot through Pennsylvania mining towns, British shipyards, Mississippi farmhouses, and peasant villages from Sonora to Abruzzi. Tens of thousands of working people poured into the city, lining up at the factory gates, looking for their share of the machinist's and mechanic's dream. 11 years on, they were still looking and still coming. In 1900, when Ford was first organizing his company, Detroit had 285,000 people living within its city limits. By 1925, it had 1.25 million people. Only New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were bigger. And Detroit was rapidly closing the gap. Detroit is El Dorado, wrote an awed magazine reporter. It is staccato America. It is shockingly dynamic. Now, that's a good quote, but that's also good writing. How did you...
This is fun.
How did you get this sense of Detroit? I mean, all of us, I think, can get a sense of Detroit now.
Yeah.
How did you get the sense of Detroit then?
That's really an interesting question. I've spoken to a couple of you in the audience tonight. I was born and raised in Detroit. And if you see Detroit, if you can look past the devastation of Detroit, and I think it is, in many ways, a devastated city now. But if you can look past that, what you can see is the imprint of that city. And it's in some of those fabulous websites you can go to about the ruins of Detroit. That's that city. I know it does take a kind of leap of imagination, but you go through the city of Detroit, you drive down Jefferson Avenue, Gratiot. There's a Detroit pronunciation for you if you ever heard of Gratiot. Yeah. Well, that's the west side. I don't go over there. That what you see is this amazingly dynamic city. I mean, those numbers, I'll give you just one specific kind of comparison. 1900, Detroit was the 15th largest city in America. I live in the 15th largest city in America today, Columbus. That tells you how far they went in those 20 years. It's the greatest boom town in the Western world. And you can see the imprint of that everywhere in that city today.
In that city, and I lived in Detroit shortly after the 1967 riots. I was there for 2.5 years, 3 years. In that city, as it existed then, as the film mentioned and as you emphasize in your book, Detroit was tightly segregated. Perhaps not by law, although there were certainly things on books and restrictions and deeds and that sort of thing, but what we would call more de facto segregation, enforced by custom and often by violence. But in that city, on the east side, there was Black Bottom.
Yes.
And next to that, sort of Paradise Valley, which I understand to have really been the entertainment district,
Right,
not
that's
so
right.
much the residential district. And all the rest of Detroit was white, basically.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
But that is the $10 million question of the book. That what I tried to capture in the book is exactly the moment where the color line is drawn. That's what happens in Detroit in the 1920s, in the early 20s. Now, I'm not trying to claim that Detroit was ever a center of racial justice, because it wasn't. But it also wasn't really strictly segregated prior to the 1920s. There was this black neighborhood, the traditional black neighborhood in Detroit was called Black Bottom, and it ran right along the east side of downtown. So do any of you, I'll ask two questions. Any of you Detroiters originally? It's not too many. Do any of you ever go to Detroit? Okay, good. That's much better.
Go to Detroit twice.
So if you're driving into Detroit, downtown, you're coming in downtown down the freeway, if you come down the Chrysler, that's Black Bottom, because they built the freeway on top of it in the 50s. Now, the thing is that Black Bottom was a black neighborhood at the turn of the century, in the same way that Hamtramck was a Polish neighborhood, or Poletown was a Polish neighborhood, or Corktown was an Irish neighborhood. And what that meant in the 19th and early 20th century is about half the people who lived in those neighborhoods were of that particular group, and the other half weren't. But if you got a neighborhood that's half Polish, it feels really Polish. And that's what Black Bottom was. It was a poor neighborhood. Half the people who lived there were black, half the people who lived there were white. They lived side by side, nobody cared. And if you were a well-to-do African American, if you were, I don't know, let's pick a profession, a doctor, you didn't live in Black Bottom. You lived in all white neighborhoods. I know that. There were only 19 black doctors in Detroit in the early 20s. I just looked up where they lived. The vast majority of them lived in white neighborhoods. And nobody cared. But what happened in Detroit is tied with that great boom town. Because as this city expanded, it filled with people from all over the world. But it also filled with a huge migration of African Americans coming out of the South. And they're all coming for the same reason. You may know nothing about the United States in 1920. You know two words: Henry Ford. So people came for jobs. Detroit in 1910 had a black population of 5,700 people. That's nothing. 1920, it had a black population of 40,000. By 1925, it had a black population of almost 80,000. And so what happened is, as that migration came up to Detroit, all of a sudden, whites started saying stuff they hadn't been saying before. They started to say, we don't want black people sitting next to us in a movie theater. They hadn't really done that much before. They don't want black people next to them in a restaurant. Most important thing is, they didn't want black people living next door to them. And they had never said that before. Now, this is not a hard thing to explain. One of the things you do when you're a professional historian is you take simple things and you make them really hard, because that way you impress your students. This is not hard. This is a rising tide of racism. It's really easy not to be racist when there are no black people around. It is different when you have a big black population. So all of a sudden, kind of, the rubber hits the road. And so what happened were people started to make this demand. Like I said in the film, you could live down in Black Bottom, that could be the black neighborhood, can't live anywhere else. Now, I just want to make it a little more complicated, because this is the tricky part. The thing is, you can't segregate a city by racism alone. You can't. For a really simple reason. Not every white person in the 1920s was a racist. So, let's say you look like a very nice person. No, you don't look at him. I was talking about you. No, him, I wasn't so sure about him. Well, let's just say you are. But just for argument's sake, you and I are neighbors. African American moves into my neighborhood, and I say, I don't want a black person in my neighborhood. You could care less. All things being equal, I can't force my racism on you. I can't. I need help. And that's what happened in Detroit in the 20s. I got help. What happened in you can see it. They wrote it down, historian's dream. 1923, Detroit Realtors Association wrote into its rule book that if an African American wants to see a house in a white neighborhood, a realtor cannot show it to him. Wasn't there in 22, wasn't there in 21, it's there in 23. All of a sudden, the big downtown banks said if an African American wants to buy a house in a white neighborhood, won't have a mortgage, can't have a mortgage. Insurance company said African American does buy a house in a white neighborhood, we won't insure it. And those big developers, as you mentioned, and there were a lot of big developers because it was a boom town, building all this new housing, particularly on the outskirts of the city. They started to put just a simple clause in the deeds of their houses saying this house can never be sold to a Negro or sometimes to a Jew.